HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Improv Nation, How We Made a Great American Art, by Sam Wasson, read by David DeVries. Ours is the only modern country which is in a state of permanent revolution. Harold Clurman, The Fervent Years, The Group Theater, and the 30s. Hi, how are you? No one had any idea this would happen. Improvisational theater, as created in the early 20th century by a young settlement worker, Viola Spolin, to foster self-expression and interaction among immigrant children, then developed by the young artists and intellectuals of the University of Chicago, then urged on by Mike Nichols and Elaine into an expression of psychological healing and liberation, then urged on further into visionary presentational forms by director Paul Sills, was laughed into what we call improv comedy, or improv for short, completely by accident. None of these giants set out for laughs, yet somehow we owe them Second City, Alan Arkin, Bill Murray, Tina Fey, The Graduate, Saturday Night Live, Waiting for Guffman, you name it. The commerce, practice, and eventual art of improv comedy were themselves improvised. And why not? Many have surmised that improv's origins date back centuries to commedia dell'arte. I don't agree, nor do I believe it was always there. Like anything else, improvisation had to be invented, and it was invented in America by young, mostly middle-class amateurs, performers, and producers who, in the true spirit of the form, were making it up as they went along. Sounds crazy at best, stupid at worst, and definitely not like the foundations of a sensible commercial or creative enterprise, let alone an entire industry and America's farthest-reaching indigenous art form, which is what improv comedy has become. As you'll soon see, no one in this story expected that to happen. But I think that's partly why people went to see and be a part of it, return for more, and keep coming back. They can't believe it. They can't believe anyone, sane or insane, would risk that kind of public humiliation. And when improv really hits the heights, they really can't believe it. No way, you'll hear over your shoulder. They must have written that. They couldn't have just made it up. On those nights, it's like watching a magic trick. But while a magician always knows more than the audience, improv's magic is just as mysterious to its improvisers. It's a special form that says, even though you're down there and we're up here, we're discovering this together. We all of us can identify with the improviser's predicament, the terror of not knowing what to say or do when all eyes are on you. That right there is a human drama on its own, and it's really happening to real people right in this moment. And if you're there in the room, you'll likely realize that the deepest, most explosive laugh, the painful, blinding, gasping for breath that has you physically bracing yourself on something solid so you don't fall over, is the laugh that erupts from the spontaneous materials of real time in real life. This is improvisation, the First Amendment in action. In improv venues across America, speech is theoretically as free as it's going to get. Free of pop culture conventions and political correctness, free of the watch what you do because it's written in stone inhibitions of everything published in print or online. In improv, nothing is written in stone. It's kind of like fireworks, Del Close, one of its foremost innovators, once said, the most ephemeral of art forms. Once it's gone, baby. There's the afterimage for a few seconds, but nobody will ever see anything like it again. The impact this ephemeral art form has had on popular entertainment, beginning with the opening of Second City in 1959, is undeniable. Since then, the number of leading comedy artists who rely on improvisational techniques has grown exponentially. America in mid-century had only 1, 2, or 3 improv comedy theaters operating at a given moment, and only in Chicago, St. Louis, and New York. Today you can see improv in practically every big city and every college campus in the country. Burgeoning and proliferating meme-like from a dingy avant-garde theater outside the University of Chicago all the way to the Colbert Report, improv has replaced jazz as America's most popular art. This is the story of that proliferation, of improv comedy's 50-year ascent from performance technique to popular entertainment, to formally and emotionally complex art, to philosophy of being, and all of it as American as democracy. For improvisation isn't merely an analog for democracy, it is democracy, demanding that its individual players and audience members uphold the democratic ideal of total collaboration, of hearing and being heard, and rewarding both sides with the very good feeling of shared humanity. This book about democracy in comedy is not in itself egalitarian, insofar as it does not consider the life and art of every single improviser who has ever improvised. Many, I hope not too many, have been left out or scaled down. A better strategy than holding up an all-encompassing mirror, I decided, would be to chart the high points, to tease out the grander story of improv's invention, cultural dissemination, and artistic development, and portray the changing circle of improvisers who kept making history happen. Who knows what the next chapter will be? A significant change at this point in improv's history is that we know now there will be a next chapter. We didn't always. For its first decades, the Second City, the world's longest-running and most successful improv and comedy theater, was always on the verge of shutting down. Its founders, better intellectuals than business people, struggled to negotiate the rough waters of changing tastes and commerce. Its leading improvisers, once discovered, were forever leaving for Hollywood and New York. Its critics, thinking they had seen it all, got used to denigrating popular improv as on a level with mediocre sitcoms, or worse, as jokey. It was only in the last decades of the 20th century, after Del Close and Charna Halpern's I.O., formerly Improv Olympic, shook up the Chicago scene, Andrew Alexander and his team of producers re-improvised old standards of Second City comedy, and the new run of luminaries from Chris Farley to Tina Fey, the first generation to come of age in a culture made by improvisation, infiltrated the establishment. That improv's financial and creative stations, a half-century after Viola Spolin first asked for an audience suggestion, were finally secured. My book ends there, but its story is still a work in progress. I leave it to someone else, to you, to everyone, really, to write the next installment. And I do mean you, whoever you are, because as any experienced improviser will tell you, every audience member watching the show is improvising too. We the Jews, 1940 to 1968. 1. 1940 to 1955. Imagine Viola Spolin, the mother, the Jewish mother, Paul Sill's mother, Tina Fey's spiritual grandmother, the mother of theatrical improvisation. There was no radio in those days, in the early part of the century, and Viola's parents, Russian immigrants, didn't have a lot of money. So as kids, Viola and her friends had to invent their own amusement. Instead of going to the theater, they played tag, jacks, marbles, hopscotch, changing the rules as it suited them, breaking the rules, inventing new ones, up and down the streets of Chicago, and for as long as the day would let them. When it got dark, Viola joined her big, rollicking Jewish socialist family, father, mother, and 5 siblings, for long and elaborate games of charades, dressing up together, falling down laughing, and singing impromptu Yiddish-flavored operas. Let's jump ahead to 1924, when Viola, now a pretty and adventurous 18-year-old with an interest in social work, enrolled at Hull House, a community center offering educational and cultural enrichment programs to Chicago's poor immigrant populations. There she trained under sociologist Neva Boyd, a progressive educator and leading play theorist. Boyd's recreation training school at Hull House instructed participants in group games and other communal activities, including theater arts. Viola called Boyd, who envisioned play as essential to emotional and physical well-being, her inspirator. Play means happiness, Boyd wrote. It is characterized by feelings of pleasure, which tend to break out in laughter. Boyd took her students out of the classroom to engage in play behavior, learn and remember why, as children, playing felt so good. When we find ourselves in situations in which we are free to act as our feelings prompt, Boyd wrote in Play, a Unique Discipline, there is no emotional conflict in the functioning of the organism. This is what happens in spontaneous play. When you play, you are free to be most you. Viola began to think about play as a way into the unconscious, a means of unearthing, as she wrote to herself, qualities which cannot be talked about. Some years later, talk was a problem for the multi-ethnic, multilingual youth of the recreational theater Viola directed at Hull House. Participants were intensely inhibited on stage. As long as these children, divided by culture and self-censored by fear, were unable to communicate, they would stay locked in, isolated from one another and ultimately from themselves. Getting them to play together, Viola believed, would loosen them up on stage and maybe light a flame under the melting pot. To provide them a non-authoritarian climate necessary for freedom, she had them extemporize together. Imagine a world where adults did not exist, she prompted. What would you do? The unfolding of the scene was quite a revelation, she wrote. Never were boys and girls more charming, more courteous to one another. They were gentle and tender. They spoke in soft tones. They were concerned with each other's simplest problems. They loved one another. They were improvising. That's what happens when you improvise. Now let's go 600 miles southwest to Manhattan, Kansas, where in 1942, 9-year-old Del Close, chubby with big glasses and crooked teeth, was sitting in a movie theater. To be or not to be? That was the question Jack Benny was asking in a film of the same name, as Del sat watching, riveted to the movie screen. When it ended, he drifted from the theater high on the film's title, To Be or Not to Be. The first intelligent question, he said, I'd heard a human being ask himself. Who was this Shakespeare, and what was he up to, and why would anyone not want to be? What did that mean, not to be? He needed more. Had his father, Del Close Sr., a depressive alcoholic jeweler, been in any way available to his son instead of caught up in his work at Del Close Jewelers or in his depression and his drinking, had Mr. Close been home the night Del discovered human beings had a choice, and therefore a very big problem, and therefore a lifelong pain no metaphoric tunnel of what-ifs could help them escape, Del would not have made the trip to his grandfather's bar in nearby Abilene. My grandfather, Close would recall, kind of caught on that I thought some kind of secret shit was going on. Stepping around the bar, the old man led Del, the incipient mad scientist of improvisation, to his first lesson in freedom. From inside a glass-door bookcase, Grandpa removed a leather-bound copy of Hamlet and put it in the boy's hands. Back now to Viola, the teacher, the social worker, the bringer together. She met and married Ed Spolin in 1940, while they were at work for the Chicago WPA. He was a set designer, she a theater director at the WPA's Recreation Project. By that time divorced and with 2 teenage sons, Paul and William Sills. When they wed, her husband had taken her surname. Expanding on her earlier efforts at Hull House, Viola was formulating techniques to help disparate populations dramatize their shared problems. By then, she had developed a format. First, she would split her players into 2 groups. The performing group would decide on a subject worthy of improvisation, play for 2 or 3 scenes for the second group, their audience, who in turn would respond to the scenes with feedback. Then they would improvise the scenes again. Every few months, the cast would pick out the best scenes and perform them for an actual audience. There were about 150 people in one cast, Viola would say. Italians, Greeks, Mexicans, Negroes, and I don't know of what other racial strains. They were of all ages and of both sexes, and they all played together. In 1940, in Chicago, Viola introduced the notion of audience suggestions. On a trip out west several years later, Viola and Ed fell in love with the brown and purple wilds of the Santa Monica Mountains and bought a patch of raw hillside on the edge of Mulholland. Ed built them a cabin in the hills over the city, and Viola bought herself a lime-green convertible, in which she would curl down the mountain to a big red barn at 1745 North La Brea, just north of Hollywood Boulevard, that she named the Young Actors Company. From the bus stop on Hollywood and La Brea, her charges trekked up an old road that led them, just behind the Hollywood Women's Club, to the clapping of a fountain and Viola's big red barn nestled in a ring of tall oaks. "It was like stepping into paradise," said actor Paul Sand, who began studying improvisation with Viola at age 9. Kneeling to child height, Viola would hike up her sarong-like dress and meet her young actors face to face, booming with warmth. She gave off the homey sense of roast chicken, herbs, and cigarettes, and her skin was tan from being outside all day playing with children. But although she was always gentle, Viola was a powerful woman with a very strong voice, said her student, Ronnie Austin. You would have cast her as a labor organizer. Imagine them playing inside, too, on stage, games Viola designed to release spontaneity. Games were for rehearsal, intended to help the players, Viola became weary of the term actor, apply their full selves to traditional scripted performances. The games were really what the whole class was, said student Jackie Joseph. Although Viola didn't call them theater games at the time, she called them improvisations. Divesting herself of parental power and authority, Viola said it was the games, not the teacher, that instructed. That was important. Playing the role of teacher could introduce what she called approval-disapproval syndrome and inhibit spontaneity. Viola was careful then not to become a rule-maker, but rather a diagnostician, prescribing a specific game to each actor to address a specific interpersonal block. Was a player struggling to relate physically with the others? Have him play contact, in which the individual touches someone every time he says a line. Was a player thinking too much? Play mirror. Mirroring someone else, you stop thinking about yourself. We were guinea pigs for the games, Paul Sand said. She was creating them on us, with us. Sometimes Viola would give the players a who, where, and a what, and have them figure out the how, tossing out some surprise little thing, as Joseph put it, from her folding chair in the back of the auditorium. The submarine window broke. Your pants just fell off. Paul, you're a fish. Go. Or when their commitment to the improvised reality broke, focus! Laughing focused them. Viola laughed all the time. Joseph said, Viola gave me, by her laughter, the confidence I needed to keep my focus. Focus on the game was essential. Actually doing, not thinking or feeling, was the way to freedom. Engaging with the imagined physical space, the where, Viola called it, was the only way an improviser could vanquish his everyday anxieties and habitual pasts and emerge with new selves, reborn in the moment. Don't think, do. Out of your head and into the space, Viola would say. Need a glass of water in your scene? Reach out and grab one. Another player might pull up a chair and join you. Now you're at a table together. The two of you have communicated where without speaking a word. You've collaborated. The games really are a form of breaking the ego, said Ronnie Austin. If you really get into full communication with others and start feeling their feelings, you really do find yourself letting go of yourself. When a room full of improvisers has let go of themselves, they can be remade into an ensemble. You can't play tag alone, Viola would remind them. In rehearsal for the 2-act children's comedy The Clown Who Ran Away, they tried an improvisation for feet. Sand said, We had to get a lot of safety pins and pin up this curtain so only our feet would show and convey what was happening to us only through our feet. Using a technique she called side coaching, directing was too close to tyranny. Viola would call out helpful reminders to focus the players as they played. See each other with your toes. Cry with your feet. It worked. Players played, and character relationships surfaced. The games freed truthful behaviors. Paul Sand, Viola's freest, most buoyant young improviser, particularly impressed a 12-year-old student in Viola's class. I remember Sand was kind of a big shot, Alan Arkin said. He was very tall and kind of ruled the roost there. The Arkins had only just moved from Brooklyn to Los Angeles. Arkin's father had come to Hollywood expecting to work as a set painter, but he arrived with his family just as the set decorators were about to strike. We didn't have a lot of money for me to do anything, Arkin said, and my Aunt Helen knew I wanted to act, so she got me a scholarship to Viola's workshop. Viola's teenage son, Paul Sills, was often present. He had been exposed to improvisation his whole life, since the days he tagged around after Viola at Hull House. I grew up with a lot of these games, Sills said. This is my family work. Visiting the young actor's company with his friend, a black-haired girl Viola introduced to the group as Elaine, Sills's interest in his mother's experiments deepened. Mother and son would sit together in the audience, wrapped in discussion about improvisation and how, if at all, they could be used to create a totally new kind of theater, a theater of personal liberation. For years he had watched improvisation create communities of players and audience, instantly bound together in ways traditional theater rarely could, through this act of communal spontaneity. He watched his mother teach them to rediscover what they had lost, what had been buried under years and years of petrified behaviors mistaken for free will, the old roads to their intuition, the diamonds, Paul Sand said, that you have as a kid. Sills watched her teach them how to be themselves. Meanwhile, in his Kansas basement, young Del Close was experimenting. As a kid, he said, I wanted to be a chemist. The glass bottles, beakers, burners, droppers, and clamps of Dell's beloved chemistry set would be tinkling there on the magic mixing table he loved like a best friend. But far more entertaining than a human friend, and far more compliant, Dell's boys-only Gilbert Chemcraft was the greatest thing his parents ever gave him. Here was the joy of limitless discovery, the wild rainbow of escape. What happens when you mix sodium bicarbonate and tannic acid? What happens if you take a hammer to a packet of potassium permanganate and sulfur, a trick Dell liked to perform for his friends? Kaboom! What is dangerous? To be or not to be, yes, yes to both. The answer for Dell, even if he ultimately discovered it was no, always started as yes. And what about people? If you stirred together the right emotions and certain odd circumstances, would ancient and ferocious selves shoot out of their bodies? Every kid assumes he has a secret identity, Close would say, and if you could just find the magic word, the godlike powers would indeed burst forth. Other people only sometimes listened. Mike Nichols could hear. Waiting for his moment, lingering on the edges of the University of Chicago coffee shop, absorbing the chorus of student dialogue around him, he could feel, beneath the words, people's real selves pouring into him. Conversation was just a public vessel, like good manners or clothing. Reality came to Nichols under cover of rhythm, silence, and volume, a secret knowledge he harvested from air. It was his superpower, honed over years of difference and estrangement. He did not always understand, but he heard. Pauses, panics, subtleties the literalness of language could not convey. Over there, he hears a man falling out of love with a girl sitting across from him. Another only pretends to hate Senator McCarthy. Really, he is afraid not to. And there, one couple he's been observing sound ready to leave, the moment Nichols has been waiting for. His cue to hover, then swoop in, just as they get up from the table, and before the busboy beats him to it, steal the unfinished food off their plates. It was humiliating. Acutely so for Nichols, who had been born Mikhail Igor Peshkowski, resplendent of Europe's cultural aristocracy, son of Dr. Nikolaevich Peshkowski and Brigitte Landauer, herself the daughter of Hedwig Lachmann, poet, translator, and one-time librettist for Richard Strauss, and the estimable Gustav Landauer, philosopher, anarchist, magazine editor, and one of the first Jews, the very first, Nichols believed, to be killed by the Nazis. Pre-Nazis, really, Nichols said, in 1919, months after the Provisional Bavarian Soviet Republic had declared Landauer their Minister of Public Information. Basically, they beat my grandfather to death over 2 days. Kicked him to death, Nichols said. It took him forever to die. Mikhail retained few details of Nazi violence from his early childhood in Berlin. Once at school, a school for Jews, some black-shirt kids stole his bicycle. He remembered that. But more formative than the scenes themselves were the intentions. Like the silence between words, what would linger years later was the panic that accompanied the Peshkowskis' mobilization. He was too young to understand what his parents were doing, pulling every string, meeting with consulates and diplomats who could help them pay, sign, and stamp their way out of Germany fast. Looking back, he would understand how they got out. Their escape, which Nichols would come to regard with a lifelong terror of a debt unpaid as mere luck, owed itself to the Hitler-Stalin Pact, which permitted Russian Jews briefly to leave Germany. "I'm incredibly lucky," Nichols would say, "and getting on that boat was my first piece of luck, because 2 weeks later the next boat to America was turned away." On April 28, 1939, Mikhail, 7, and his brother, 3, boarded the Bremen with nothing but 15 marks sewn into their shirts and 8 words of the native language. "I don't speak English, and, to ward off the kindness of strangers, please don't kiss me." Neither parent accompanied them. Mrs. Peszkowski was too sick to travel, and their father was already in New York. He had gone a year earlier to set up a new medical practice. The first thing Mikhail saw when he got to New York, to America, was a Jewish deli. "Is that allowed?" he asked his father. "It is here." His father said they could be Jews in America, but in his intuitiveness, Mikhail heard something different. Hiding wouldn't hurt. "I don't know what happened," he said, "but I must have, without knowing it, wanted to put Europe aside completely." He said Europe, but you could hear Jew. No one would tell him how to be an American. The secrets of assimilation took figuring out, had to be gleaned. I think there is an immigrant's ear that is particularly acute for, how are they doing it here? What must I do to be noticeable, to be like them? 5 years later, more injustice. Nichols's father died of leukemia. It was his X-ray machines. In those days, few people knew the risks of radiation. Nichols's mother took a series of jobs, bakery, bookstore, but without her husband, money would be scarce. She grew angry. Nichols grew angrier. Every young boy feels different, but unlike most of his classmates, Mikhail really was. He sounded like a Nazi to them and had no grip on their customs. They fucked me on baseball. He did not carry in him the freedom they took for granted, and perhaps most humiliating of all, he was bald. A bad reaction to a whooping cough vaccine rendered Mikhail completely hairless. "The kid was as far outside as an outsider can get," said one of his classmates at the Dalton School, and, like Nichols, a future titan of improvisation, Buck Henry. Mikhail saw how they watched him, but assimilating, or trying to, was grasping at quicksand. Nichols, the new family name, made him a liar. Even if the Goyim bought the disguise, the Mikhail Igor inside him never could. "He's the one," Nichols said of the enraged child. "He's somewhere saying, 'Don't fuck with me,' and I can't stop him." Which isn't to say he didn't make a beautiful Mike Nichols. Consider, but not too closely, all that convincing blonde hair and those thin, elegant eyebrows. Consider his grateful smile, his rich, rolling laugh, the 3-pound diamond he had for a brain. They would never know Mike was a refugee for life. "That was cast in bronze," Nichols said. "That's where I was chained in the galaxy forever." In self-defense, he learned to hear, or imagined he heard, what people thought. It makes for being socially adept, Nichols said. He was too new to this business of hearing to understand that his exile's ear, all that sensing instead of seeing, would sharpen his powers of interpersonal acuity into an instinct verging on ESP, Mozart via Freud. But in time, he would learn that language and behavior were utterly distinct. One guarded truth and one revealed it, and that by mastering the secrets of human motivation, one could master one's enemies. One day, he would get back at them, or it. "I was motivated then," he said, "and for a long time afterwards, by revenge." His prodigious brain had earned him a scholarship to the University of Chicago in 1950, but all Mike Nichols knew, lurking in that coffee shop, was hunger. He had two choices. Either he could attempt the leftovers method or, for a full meal, walk into the student cafeteria backwards, through the exit, to give the impression he had already paid, and then grab a bowl of peas. What's the worst that could happen? If one of the busboys caught and hauled Nichols back to New York or Germany, at least then he'd stop feeling bad about feeling good, and finally feel bad for good, which is what he, a survivor, deserved. To hold your attention, Dell would tell you about the time he ran away from home for the traveling geek and freak show carnivals he knew or heard were crammed with hoopla, string games, rat games.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?